Should I put that
Okay, can you see it?
thing on live? What's that?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you and I can hear you on the phone.
On the phone? What about, hang on, if I mute on the phone, can you hear me now on the computer? Can you hear me?
No, can't hear you now.
Ah. Do you know?
Unless it's muted somewhere.
Microphone working.
Yeah, look, it's muted.
Oh, what?
There we go. Is that up again?
How about now?
Great.
Hey, wicked. Okay,
Fairly
amazing.
low battery on that one.
Oh yeah, let's plug
Let's
you in.
plug you in, yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so I'll hang up the phone and it's fine, you're still there, right? That's you got.
So how are you gonna show the screen with that? So
Yeah.
Is that the
Let's
idea?
see if I can see you and the screen right now. That's all right, isn't it? How's that?
Can't really see it. I'm trying to think if there's another way. I mean, unless I share.
I mean, I could move the computer over to
Put it
there.
over there. The only thing is, I just realised I've got a script here.
Oh, your script's here.
Yeah. So I should have
right,
sent
okay.
that. So
Well, just leave it like it is. It's fine.
is it all right? So I've got something to reference. Do you think? Or
Yeah. That's all right.
it'd be nice if people could see
Oh, yeah.
pictures, wouldn't it?
Just email the slides to the whoever's at the other end or to the
Yeah.
group. And then do the full next slide, please, when you want to move to the next one, so if they want to follow them.
Do you hear that? We're going to email you the slides so that you can see them.
So high tech.
I'm going to get my pen.
It's like the teaching career I never knew I had. What am I doing?
Before we start, should we do just quick introductions? Quick introductions whilst that's getting sorted out. I'll tell you what, I'll get Jess back on the phone. And then, because obviously, then we can hear her. All right, hello again. Yeah, so Nick's just sending you the slides. Whilst he's doing that, we thought we'd just do quick introductions. So we've got here, I'm Dan, obviously. You know me, you all know me really. So that'll do for me, I think. Set up this group beginning of last year. A few of us wanted to look at the intersection of sort of class struggle, Marxism and stuff, and decolonialism, and aspects of sort of revolutionary English history as well, and kind of looking at all of that. That's what this group is about. Jack, do you want to?
Yeah, sort of general interest in radical history. Read a lot of sort of Napoleonic warfare stuff, both novels and history, and was kind of in a what books should I read, and the sort of radical edge of it, rather than it is we're the good guys, the French are the bad guys. Let's go and have rip-roaring adventures on the high seas. And then saw Dana posted about this book, and I thought that's exactly the sort of thing I want to read on it. So this is the first one of these I made it to.
I'm Drew, and just bumped into Dan at the cafe and found out about this. So these things happen. But but we met before at like we had things to do land justice groups that are something I'm interested in, mainly because I have been quite wanting to get into the sort of whole land reform thing that's happening up in Scotland at the moment. And so I actually was like working for a community-run estate, basically, up in Scotland. It's the second community buyout that happened in like 1999. So
What's that?
Neudark Foundation.
What's a community buyout?
So it's basically where the people in the community bought the land from the original landowner, but it was a large estate. So I think it was about 75 people were in the community, and now it's up to about 111.
Interesting.
And they are joint owners, basically,
Yeah,
of this big bit of land.
interesting.
Yeah, and so I was working for them as a ranger.
Yeah, right.
But it's also very much linked into my interest in like sort of Scottish Gaelic culture, because there's a lot of traditionally Gaelic speaking areas that are starting to do their own community buyouts. So so that's my main interest. But I'm also interested in history as well.
Yeah. Well, this history is all about the
This is-
commons, the enclosures of the commons, and the loss of common land and the fights over that. So it's all linked, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is history that should rouse you into action in the present, because it's relevant. It's the construction of the modern world system. Why we do have private property as it is now, why the laws are the way they are now, why we have so many prisons, like why we have rich and poor, why our societies are structured the way they are. And one of the key subjects, the two key subjects, is the commons being enclosed, and we being enslaved and incarcerated and constrained and terrified, to produce the world that we're living in. And it's relevant in that space. Well, I don't know what to say about me.
You're Kieran.
Yeah, I do a bit of historical stuff. I'm a well-known rabble rouser. Ranter, this chapter deals with the ranters, so I particularly identify with the ranters, and I've done studies of them and try to reproduce the kind of frame of mind or way of behaving, a way of thinking that the ranters developed at that point in time. I think that's a lot into rants. Other stuff like that, and community activism, I'm sharing stuff.
Jess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right, full of apologies. Yeah, thank you very much for letting me join. I really appreciate it. I'm kind of a bit of a shy observer, so I'm going to observe from my room. I'm not particularly political, but I'm definitely a lover of all things knowledge. So, just really interested to hear what you've all got to say. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Nick.
How's the sound, Jess? Can you hear us clearly?
Really well.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, so I'm Nick, so I'll be doing the presentation in a moment. Just a bit of a jack of all trades, really just kind of generally curious, love literature, history, interested in politics, interested in psychology, power structures work, power dynamics, things like that. Kind of more of a generalist than a specialist, I'd say, really. That's me.
Cool. Just, I'm going to turn you off the phone to save my battery. You can still hear us, can't you? And then at the end of Nick's presentation, I'll put you back on the phone so that you can join in the discussion after, if you want to.
I'm sure I won't. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Cool. So
the only person joining us remotely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she
This is like a guinea pig.
Slides.
It's streaming.
Test subjects.
Yeah.
Lucky you, Jess. The slides are on the Hydra group, as Dan mentioned.
Jess isn't on the Hydra group yet. That's the other one. I can forward them, should I? Can't I?
Yeah.
I should.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Okay.
That's the group if she's.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do both, but I'll just forward for now.
My audience of millions following this via the Hydra group. So, hang on, what's that doing?
I can't open my phone for some reason.
It's not letting you.
It says I haven't got the proper app for
Oh
that.
shit. That's annoying.
No,
It might be because it's a particular format, you know. And this has gone skill-if on the screen.
Oh,
It was
how tedious.
okay a moment ago.
Yeah, it's fine.
Try to escape out and then F5 again.
Seems to have frozen, so maybe it will just need a moment.
Is it to do with this or something?
Well, it's all to do with that, yeah, but it's not,
Oh, it's frozen.
it seems to not be
Oh,
working, so I guess I'll just crack on and then hopefully it will start again.
Oh, that's a pain. Do you want to turn it on and off and off?
That's the thing. Is it without go the Luddite way?
Yeah, right. This is the thing, isn't it? Reliance on people power over technology. So we're here to talk about the Putney debates, but more specifically this chapter in the Many-Headed Hydra, which is the divarications of the Putney debates. So it's a chapter that covers a lot of ground historically and geographically. So I'm mainly, I found that as I was reading it and studying it, I kind of got sucked into the Putney debates in particular. So that would be my main focus. But we also know that it goes to Ireland, it goes to Naples, Barbados, the Gambia and Virginia. So I'm hoping that after we talk about Putney and Ireland a little bit, we can think about those other places too, because they're all part of they're woven together into a narrative by Lineburn and Rediker. Right, it's changed now, but it still seems to be frozen. So hopefully it'll come back in a little bit. And I'll just catch up. Okay. So, because it kind of relies on the slides a little bit. So to start off with, I mean, they've got this nice visual, which will hopefully slideshow. Yeah, let's try that.
It's so slow, isn't it?
From the beginning, that's all right. Yeah. I know it does work, it just needs to kick up the arse. So,
On to the other side. Ah. Oh,
doesn't like me.
Hey.
All right. So I've just got to click about half an hour in advance. That's the trick, isn't it? So okay, so here's an artist's depiction of the Putney debates. So what were they? They were a series of parleys, of discussions between Cromwell and his generals and the rank and file troops of the New Model Army, and this took place in the middle of or the end of the First English Civil War. And basically it marked this schism between the soldiers, the rank and file guys on the ground doing the dirty work of the First Civil War, doing the fighting, and the officer class who had commanded them. So men like Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax, who were known as the Army Grandees. You can see around the edges there some of the issues that were brought up by the Levellers and others at the debates. So these are very big but important themes which get articulated in this chapter. So the reorganisation of constituencies, equality before the law, freedom of conscience, one man, one vote, freedom for impressment, very important, and so on. So Lineburn and Rediker write, this was a unique moment in the history of English democracy and radicalism, and the way we think about power, the way that power is administered and exercised as well. Arguably because it was this moment when it was really articulated what England could have become, ultimately didn't. So it's a what-if moment, and so much possibility in these ideas that were raised at the time between these two very different groups of men, two different classes, with two very different ideas about power, really. And the trigger for the debates was kind of important. It was the New Model Army had made this decision to set up camp between Hampton Court and London. So there was suddenly this possibility of 18,000 armed soldiers marching on London to make their case for payment and equal treatment. So there was a lot of anxiety, and this was an anxious and very kind of difficult time all round, very lively time, I guess you could say. So first of all, let's have a look at the New Model Army, a bit of background. As I say, as I dove into this, I kind of went down the rabbit hole. I haven't looked at the Civil War since I was in school. So you might know some of this already, but why the New Model Army? Why were they important? Well, They came out of they were set up during the First English Civil War as a centralised professional fighting force, and they'd been formed as a parliamentary army in 1645 as part of the struggle against the King, Charles I. So again, a time in English history when people were asking questions about authority, about who has the right to rule. And before this, it was a kind of fragmented bands of militia doing the fighting. But this was a centralised professional force. And in accordance with Puritan values, many of them had been handpicked for piety. There's some debate over that, actually, how many of them were pious Puritans. But we know they were a hotbed for radical ideas, some of them more kind of conservative in the way we think of Puritan religious thought. But then you had groups like the Levellers who were right in the thick of it, as we'll see. So they had this radical streak at the core of them, which is important. And it was also important that the majority of them were commoners. They weren't the landowning ruling class, although the generals, of course, usually were, with some exceptions. But from what I found reading about them, they were ordinary common folk, many of them. And there was a sense of democracy going back to the kind of radical thinking as well. One of the central demands that motivated the First Civil War being the curbing of royal power. But despite that democratic identity, some of them had been conscripted as well. We know that. So there was already impressment and this clash between two kind of ideas of freedom and expression of who they were and their rights, and then being forced into service, impressment being like press ganging, being basically forced to fight for a cause. And to top it all off, they hadn't been paid in a year, which is important. This is the democratic bit. Lineber expresses them as free commoners of England fighting for the defence of their own and other people's and the people's rights and liberties. So they were given they were supposed to have been given a wage. I think they were paid at the beginning, but now, 3 years into the fighting, they haven't been paid for a year. They're tired and angry, and they've now pressed their case. They've camped outside London, and they forced these debates.
And at this point, they've won the war, as it's the First English Civil War is over.
Yeah.
They actually won.
So he's imprisoned.
I mean, it didn't really happen suddenly. It's been quite a process.
But at this,
on since the previous June, when the King was arrested, the army went into mutiny at that point.
But he's in house arrest.
And then moved towards London. The King, well, we'll talk about that. I'll tell you about what happened.
So this is an interesting one. I found this online. You can see that there's Charles, and yeah, you're right. There were mutinies. There was dissent among the ranks of the New Model Army, partly because of this feeling that the grandees were kowtowing to the monarch, and indeed they were. So while he was under house arrest, they won the First Civil War, but then they were going to treat with Charles. So the idea of executing the king for treason wasn't on the table really at this point, at least not among the rulers, the leaders of the army, the elites in the army. And of course, what's Charles standing on? Looks a bit like a hydra, doesn't it? There at the bottom. I thought it was quite nice. So they were pissed off. Cromwell and co were trying to appease the king rather than demanding reforms, and this caused an uproar among the men who had fought to depose a tyrant. They hadn't been paid for their victory over the royalist forces, despite being instrumental in several key battles. Those in Parliament weren't actively representing their interests, and they were fighting for an end to impressment as well. But the abiding mood was that it had all been for naught, and they'd fought themselves into slavery. So the oppression of the king had been removed, but it would there was now this possibility that it would be either restored or replaced with elevated generals who would do the same thing. And I thought this was interesting because in other chapters we've learned about how the idea of the Hydra being harnessed by elites, by those in power, to achieve their ends. And this is kind of a case of the Hydra threatening to bite back now, turning around and demanding that the needs of the people are actually met, and they get fair representation and payment as they've been promised. So it's a moment of great revolutionary potential. So yeah, what actually happened? So the Levellers under Thomas Rainborough and others brought an agreement, came up with the Agreement of the People, which had a series of demands. So I've put some of the main ones here. Some of these won't seem like a big deal to us now, but at the time this was massive. So equality under the law, again, a fair trial, and being seen to have the same stature under the law, regardless of your class, your status, your property rights. That was a big deal. Religious tolerance, the law in English, not Latin. Again, a focus on being able to defend yourself, being able to understand what's going on in terms of the way that power is operating, being able to resist that. Abolition of the death penalty for theft, which was still the case, as we've seen in other chapters. That links up with the end to impressment as well, people being expropriated from their land, being sent off to the New World, being forced into slavery. And then also the jury trials and the right to call witnesses. So some legal reforms, social reforms, but again, really this push for equality. And they elected their own agitators as well. So one of the most fun I had this week, and we can't quite see the quote there, I'm going to have to read it out, but I've been going through the minutes of the Putney debate, which somebody put online, which is quite heavy going, but you find some great stuff if you stick with it.
Yeah, I bet.
That was you, Jack. Yeah, nice one. Yeah. So one of the voices of the agitators. So these were elected from among the New Model Army's ranks. There was an attempt by Fairfax to become their representative and fob them off for a bad deal, but they weren't having that. So they wanted representatives to fight for their best interests. And Thomas Rainborough, who was the de facto leader of the Levellers, kind of came to the surface as their main advocate. So he was a military man, background in a Navy man, background in lots of battles. And he felt crucially that the denial of access to the commons was, quote, the greatest tyranny that was thought of in the world, end quote. And the quote that you can't see there, which I can't see either, is something like the poorest he that is in England has as much right as the greatest he.
I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as is the greatest he.
Great.
And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government.
Thank you.
That's the line.
So, yeah, people wanting the right to vote for their own representatives, to wanting a step participatory democracy. This was radical at this time.
It's the first example of the phrase no taxation without representation being used.
In that document?
At this point, not in that document, the level of pamphlets that are being issued at this time.
Yeah.
At the civil level movement, that is.
Massive.
The level movement in the army, all connected. They have their own propaganda network, magazines, magazines. And they matched each other. So there was organisation in civil society, and then there was the organisation in the army. As long as the levels had some traction in the army, there was still a chance, as you said, that a different one could be possible.
Right.
But it was down to how much traction.
Yeah,
in the army.
It was key. It's cool. So no taxation without representation. And on the other side, You've got Ireton, Henry Ireton, speaking for the grandees. And this is the kind of mentality that really is at the heart of the debates. So that demand for equality we've just been talking about. And then on the side of the grandees, so he says, men may justly have by birthright that we should not seclude them out of England, that we should not refuse to give them air and place and ground and the freedom of the highways and other things, but that by a man's being born here, he shall have a share in that power that shall dispose. I can't see it. Put that in slideshow.
If you go on the bottom, you should be able to see.
Here we go. But that man's being born here, he shall have a share in that power that shall dispose of the lands here and of all things here. I do not think it a sufficient ground. So it's very interesting. You think about the some of the contemporary arguments along those lines, and it's still the same basic principle that Ireton was asking who has the right to vote, and his answer, well, the question was, sorry, he wasn't asking it, the levellers were asking it, who has the right to vote? Ireton's response was, those who know what's best for the kingdom. And who does that happen to be? Well, the next quote is the persons in whom all land lies and those in corporations in whom all trading lies. So it speaks for itself. It speaks for itself, yeah.
Ireton encapsulates his whole view pretty close to the beginning of the debates when he says explicitly, let's pause, gentlemen, because I have an eye to the rights of property. The eye and eye to the rights of property and the authority of fathers over their children. And your governors can be viewed as your fathers. So he was quite explicit about his ideological position.
To which Rainborough says, whose mother and father, which kind of mother and father should we, So I think that's a really important idea to latch on to, because what is authority? Well, in this conservative view, which we can recognise in modern conservative viewpoints, arguably, it's people who own the lands, people who are already the land-owning class, property-owning class.
Is there an argument there? Well, read it, I'm not sure if it was in here or somewhere else, that if they'd gone out, given everybody a vote, people could have gone, we actually quite like the monarchy, we'll vote the king back in. So Cromwell and Ireton were kind of doing we fully support this idea of a democratic system, but the people quite like the time under the old king before the wars without everything else. If it goes to mass public vote, we're going to get the king back. So they were actually being more radical in trying to say, we need the people who led this to be in charge and making the decision.
There's a quote from Colonel Nathaniel Rich, who was sitting next to Ireton in the debate, who meanwhile expressed the fear if the propertyless 4/5 of the kingdom voted, they might legislate that there shall be an equality of goods and estates. In other words, that's what they were frightened. They weren't frightened of the poor voting monarchy, right? They were frightened of the poor would vote for basically a workers' republic. I think you should look at the agitators and the levellers as well. They're much more modern than any other political movement there here up until that point. And in fact, in the end, you had Soviets that developed, and the officers had lost control. And the rank and file were determining what was going to happen.
Trade revolution. All right, well, I'll get through the rest of this and then we'll get into that. So here's another voice of the agitator. This wasn't a good actual. I couldn't find a picture of Edward Sexby. So got an actor from The Devil's Hall. Have you seen that? Yeah. Okay. It looked good. It looked decent. Yeah. So this is Edward Sexby. We have engaged in this kingdom and ventured our lives, but it seems now, unless a man have a fixed estate in this kingdom, he hath no right in this kingdom. I mean, again, how doesn't that resonate with modern values about, the importance of property, the scarcity of property?
See that quote there?
Yeah.
There's a bit missing there, which is quite crucial. I wonder that we were so deceived. He said, after we ventured our lives, I wonder that we were so deceived. Because in a way, it was the first people dying. So there was impressment. There was mass volunteering as well. And people expected to get some gain out of it.
Well, yeah,
At the end,
they're given
and
their lives.
they'd staked everything in it, and they'd engaged in political agents in that. And they'd been promised something by Cromwell and the Grandees, and now they knew they were going to be betrayed.
Yeah, fair play. Yeah, sense of betrayal. And I'm resolved to give my birthright to none. Again, this question of, well, what is your birthright? Do you have a stake in this country because you're born here? And Lineberg goes on to expand that goes back to Francis from the last chapter. It says, even if you're not born here, Francis was a black maid who became a figure of kind of revolutionary ideas and equality. But this idea that, it doesn't belong to the gentry, it belongs to everybody. So there have been three kind of big interpretations that the chapter identifies. So do a quick gloss of those. Catch up myself. So first one is the social democratic view. So the project was parliamentary democracy. Its subject, the respectable citizen worker. So again, no taxation without representation. And obviously this goes in all kinds of directions, but as a general principle, it's the idea of participating in the administration of power, having a vote, having a say, which again was incredibly radical at this time. The second one, interpretation, people have often tapped into the welfare state, the idea that power holds a responsibility to care for people. And we know that Aneurin Bevan had an interest in Thomas Rainsborough, and wrote about him. And this amazing quote ties in with this central idea expressed at the Putney debates: either poverty must use democracy to destroy the power of property, or property in fear of poverty will destroy democracy. Think about a gated community. That's the literal expression of something like that. And then thirdly, I like this one particularly, links with decolonisation. That's a not great quality photo of the 5th Pan-African Congress at Manchester in 1945, which was a turning point for the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movement in Africa and Pan-Africanism. C.L.R. James was there, amongst others. And national liberation of oppressed states, personal liberation of oppressed peoples. So, the scope and influence of the Putney debates is massive. It's a wellspring for these powerful galvanizing ideas about freedom. And you can hang your hat on it, I think, whether you're radical, a Marxist, a centrist, whatever your kind of political stripes, you can find something in it that is incredibly important. And then, where's it gone? There we go. So this is what Linebaugh and Rediker add to the debate, which is very important. This idea of the commons or slavery. So he focuses on three. So for me, I felt this was a bit of a leap at first, but on reflection, I found it a really persuasive argument. At first, I thought it's too much of a binary. It's too black and white. Which commons or slavery? That whole statement that he makes, right? But I think he makes a really good case for this idea. So it's important to question it, because I know you know the book back to front, but for someone coming to it like me, when I read that, I think, oh God, that's a very bold statement.
It needn't be a binary if you look at the book. It's the lens they're using at that particular part. You could think of it, the commons of carceral society, prisons, or the commons, or one of the other points is commons or the death penalty.
But that still feels quite stark to me.
Yeah, but Yeah, but it is stark.
Yeah.
Like, but as you said, it's persuasive. And the more you look at it, it looks actually true.
Yeah. So
Truth.
I mean, there's
This is the fork in the road, isn't it? The divarication of the debate. Which way is it going to go?
which way is it going to go?
Roller commons.
And we know, which way it did go. And there's that quote from Rainborough that kind of links up with what you were saying earlier, Kieran, as well. I would fain know what the soldier had fought for all this while. He had fought to enslave himself, to give power to men of riches, men of estates, perpetual slavery. So in the chapter, there are three focal points of that idea of slavery. One is impressment, as mentioned, which went on a great deal. Forced military or naval service, the dreaded press ganging. There was the spiriting away of servants, children, and common folk to the new world, literally kidnapping. As the authors say, there was a whole vocabulary that sprung up around nabbing, kidnapping, the boats going down to the harbour loaded with the people who were being stolen, taken away from their land and their world and taken off to work in the new world. And then there was the slavery as we think about it, I think most commonly today, which is obviously the transatlantic slave trade, and then also the enslavement of Europeans in parts of North Africa and elsewhere. And for me, one of the things that brought me round to it was I've been reading a bit of C.L.R. James, and I think there's a quote. I'm going to do a bit of a left turn here. There's a quote C.L.R. James reads on Captain Ahab in this book I'm reading, which is called Renegades, Mariners and Castaways. He talks about Ahab as a psychological type. Of course, Ahab's a fictional character, but all fiction comes from life. It's very relevant. And he describes Ahab as the crew are not human beings, but things. He reads Ahab in this way. As he calls them, manufactured men. For him, their permanent condition is sordidness. For a moment, he has lifted them out of himself by his crusade. So again, thinking about the psychology of tyranny and a particular way of looking at everyday people, looking at the common folk, it's easy to make a link between that kind of mentality and an exploitative capitalism. I think we see it in all kinds of ways in leaders and in exploiters. And another example that ties in with it, speaking of capitalism, the way that prisons have become factories, and always have been, but are now even more formalized and even more profitable.
And vice versa, factories.
Yeah, true, actually.
Yeah.
Always have been.
Yeah. Wage labour.
As I said, the original projectors like
Interesting.
Richard Hackley figured colonies as outdoor prisons.
Yeah, that's in there.
The plantations were constructed that sense. It's castle institution.
So there's a confluence between these two. And it's in this Diggers song, which is great. I've only put a bit of it in there. But since tyranny came in, they counted now no sin to make a gale of gin, an engine, to starve poor men therein. Stand up now, stand up now. That's Natural Prison on the right there. Maricopa County, I think it is. They're making army uniforms, appropriately enough. And on the left there, there's a still from Andor. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's a new Star Wars series. It's really good, and it has a really great kind of critique of prison life and the revolutionary potential of the prisoner. I'd really recommend it, especially if you like sci-fi. So anyway, back to the Putney debates. I'm going to wrap up now because it's going on a bit, isn't it? So I've got this is a moment missed. So what happened next is Charles I escaped house arrest, and the royalist threat was suddenly renewed, and with it the moment for radical change seemed to have been lost. But the mutinies were still happening, as you mentioned earlier, Kieran. So Coltbush was one mutiny that was suppressed, and then Bishopsgate the execution of John Lockyer, the soldier, was another turning point for the Levellers. So this radical core was diluted. And even though the Rump Parliament saw this blockading of Westminster and kind of forced the execution of Charles, just 2 years later, there were these purges of both the Levellers and the Diggers. And here's an image of Fairfax's troops riding up to, I think it's probably George's Hill, to get rid of the Diggers, and basically chuck them off their commune. And the quote from Gerard Winstanley: "England is not a free people till the poor that have no land have a free allowance to dig and labour the commons." There's that central idea again. And then, guess what? George's Hill is now St George's Hill near Weybridge, and it's described as the Beverly Hills of the UK. So this was the home of the Diggers. But
One of them.
what? Sure.
One of them.
It's described.
They're settled many colonies.
It's described as a central one in the chapter.
It was the biggest one, but there were about 20.
So the
There's another big
same
one at Wigan in the north.
Oh,
Yeah.
some south to north then.
Yeah, that was the biggest actually.
So the same old debates. Again, you can see the headlines: squatters moved into a free. So I thought that was an interesting counterpoint in terms of housing justice there. The irony of the place that was one of the Diggers' strongholds now, but I think that's actually the house, Woodlawn. And again, we were talking about the eye to property. You mentioned Ayrton's quote, right? Listen to this. So in response to the squatters moving in, local councillor Peter Harmon said, "My personal feeling is that you shouldn't be going into a property that doesn't belong to you. I don't condone it, and I would like to see the site developed." So, yeah. How'd you guess? So again, it comes back to this core debate about property rights. It's I think a lot of people could understand that first point, not going into a property that doesn't belong to you. But that second point is about capital becoming self-reproducing, about enrichment of your own position in the world. Again, going back to Ahab, that's really what we're talking about as a psychological type. A disrespect, even a hatred of working people, of common people, in favour of a kind of self-aggrandized vision of your own worth. So it's interesting to ask the question, what is the commons now? Is it nature, public spaces, state institutions like the NHS, ones that we know have been privatised? Another modern resonance, which is, I think, a small example, but quite relevant, is recently the right to wild camp was lost in England because of this Dartmoor case. And this is because of a multi-millionaire hedge fund manager, the guy in the picture there, who lodged the court case against people's right to camp. So these debates go on, except now we don't think of them as a commons that we all have a right to so much as somewhere where we're able to perhaps walk and camp. I think the idea has been diluted. So to wrap up, I just want to talk about Ireland for a moment. So this was shocking to me for my lack of literacy about Irish history, I was saying to you, Dan. So after the debates were quashed, and after the Second Civil War was over and Charles had been executed, it was on to Ireland. So Drogheda was the site of one of the worst massacres in Irish history. Every 10th man of the soldiers killed and the rest shipped off to Barbados. Again, a systematic approach to domination in favour of turning them into objects. Again, men as manufactured men, expropriate them from their land, step one, force them into crime, step two, and step three, imprison them or ship them off. And again, once again, the New Model Army did the dirty work. They were paid off with stolen lands. But as that image shows, Many of them were near starvation conditions at this point. And the upshot of it was tens of thousands of Irish slaves sold to the New World. But my other takeaway is that there's this big metaphor for rivers in the book. And, you know, as mentioned, those are radical ideas at the time. And in some ways they still are. But now, these, you know, what was the upshot of the Putney debates? It was these kind of points coming to the surface and becoming mainstream, if you like. Authority needing more justification, participatory democracy, death penalty called into question, only suspended in 1965, but obviously the Levellers were against the death penalty, and then the welfare state as well. And that's it.
Cool, thanks. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, so yeah, you guys haven't been here before. So we haven't really established a formal proceedings of how we debate, just the idea principle that, you know, everyone gets a chance to contribute.
Darling, that's one
Oh yeah, let's go and get stuck in. Yeah. I might move this computer over to there so that there's a sort of bit of coverage of the room. Your one, and if you don't need your
No, it's all right.
okay, cool. Okay, so here. Yeah, so
That's really interesting, yeah. Research.
I was just going down the rabbit hole, it's like, every line there's something to do with it. But there's, as I mentioned, there's parts of that chapter that I didn't even touch on, like all of the response.
I'm good. Can you see us still all right?
Yeah, quite a section, large section.
Hello, yeah, yes.
And then the interconnections then between what's happened and Putney.
Cool.
And then, I mean, the question is, can I start then? Might as well.
Come on then, Kieran.
The question is, why Ireland? Why do this at this point? And there's a lot of resistance in the army, and you know, democratic elements, levellers in the new model army. The agitators are saying that the Irish were thrown off the shackles. They were willing to go and put the shackles back on them after we'd won our freedom. It's the basic idea behind it. And there was the absolute knowledge amongst the rank and file that the point of the expedition to Ireland, the primary point of it from their perspective, was to destroy the radicalism that was in the country at the time. This is a ploy that's always used now. If a state power, an authority, is having trouble engaged in a foreign adventure, engaged in warfare of some form or another, especially if you've got an insurgent army in mutiny, then you want to get that army fighting again and under military discipline. And especially if it's a war of appropriation, which could then pay for the war, pay for the major investors. The rank and file soldiers suffered massive attrition during the course of the almost 3 years of the campaign, 2 to 3 years.
Do you think the invasion of Ireland was as much aimed at the Levellers as a counter-revolutionary strategy?
It's a counter-revolutionary strategy. It was aimed at the Irish as well, to put down their insurgency and colonise the place, enclose large sections of it. So what you didn't mention there, the key character in the chapter was mentioned quite a few times, was Sir William Petty. Sir William Petty was the Surgeon General in the expedition to Ireland, Surgeon General for the New World Army under Oliver Cromwell, and he'd been here in Oxford along with all the wise men. Oxford went on to set up the founder member of the Royal Society himself. And he did what was called the Down Survey, a cadastral map of Ireland. The first modern detailed piece of quantity surveying on a macro level to calculate what the goods available were in Ireland too, so they could be portioned off and sold off. And that included the labour he was now understanding labour in an abstract way, which is mercantilism. Yeah. He was the father of, he is generally thought was the progenitor of modern economics.
Who are you talking about?
Sir William Petty. Sir William Petty is a crucial figure. And he said that the Irish population, to be fit to be shipped off to the colonies, they're just human labour power. And the idea that you could just make a map of a place like that and then appropriate all those lands and apportion it out to companies of people, something really quite new and terrifying, really. The human beings have been reduced to that, and he calculated also the extent of the disaster then that had been visited upon the Irish by Cromwell and the Parliament for aggrandisation, for wealth, and to suppress the revolutionary position of the levellers in the country at the time. Petty calculated that aside from those slaves shipped off to Barbados and Jamaica, with displacement, famine, disease, and outright massacre, that more than 617,000 Irish either died or killed or died of disease and famine or shipped out as slaves. The population of Ireland at the time was 1.2 million. So that means that well over 50% of the population suffered attrition. During those 2 years of Cromwell's, they were pushed off the land, had their land stolen. And that's a genocide. That is a genocide by any standard, modern standard of what is known as genocide. So the Irish hatred of Cromwell is no little thing. But the crucial aspect of it was breaking the revolutionary fervour that was present amongst this broad church radical movement, the levellers, ranging through constitutional levellers wanting constitutional change, through diggers wanting communism, through ranters wanting anarchism.
Well, I mean, I hadn't seen it really from the English point of view before, but which is quite interesting, you know, sort of to hear the details. But I mean, the idea though of the mapping was like certainly precedents, like, you know, going back quite a long time. That was the whole, essentially, like with, you know, where you can basically, if you can map the place, if you can like,
Once you mapped it, it's yours.
once you mapped it,
Well, you got it. I mean, there's often form of speech acts going on, because that's mentioned later in the chapter as well, as far as the chats that the Royal Africa Company used then on incorporation in 1660. Prince Rupert claimed all inlets and harbours ranging down the West African coast to the Cape of Good Hope.
Where does that come from, that idea that when to map it, humans?
It's the kind of, you got the map, you got a flag.
Right,
yeah. I mean, I think like that was something that Queen Elizabeth I basically was quite important in instigating, at least in England, because, you know, she had like special advisors like John Dee, who was kind of known for a lot of things, but also one of his things was that he learned from Mercator about maps. And so she found him extremely valuable because he basically mapped the Northwest Passage, which basically meant that she had then claim to Canada and the Northwest Passage. I mean, so that was like, you know, generations before Cromwell.
Yeah.
But I think it also
It's the Hackloop brothers I was talking about. They were here with John Dee. John Dee was in Oxford as well.
Yeah.
For a long time.
well, that's it.
The
Yeah.
Hackloops wrote the navigations and discoveries of English seafarers, which was like the original colonial projecting document. And yeah, it was on a load of the charts.
But I think also because like at the time there was so much international movement towards that. You know, the Spanish, like the French, everybody were like trying to set up their own, you know, colonies, really. You know, and yeah, the English were just the same, really. And so, but there were, I mean, from my perspective, I kind of see, I didn't know what was the internal dynamics of like the Cromwellian army at the time, which is why it's interesting, like what you were saying, to hear, you hear what was, didn't really know about the levelers, didn't know about the, I mean, I'd heard of them, but I don't really know that much about the history. But the idea of like, for me, mostly the way that I pictured it before is that Cromwell, you know, and I'm kind of, this is my interpretation, so I'm willing to be, you know, educated on this, but Cromwell being a Puritan, being essentially a Presbyterian, which was also part of the democratizing of the church, you know, he had particularly major dislike against Catholics. You know, so him going over to Ireland was basically to try and eradicate Catholicism in that area. It was totally
in the parliamentary debates of 1651, it was put like to the motion: shall we just eradicate the population completely and go for total genocide? Then it was objected, if we eradicate them completely or displace,
Who will work with Frontex?
who's going to work the land, and who's going to do the work for us?
Yeah.
So we're pushing them off the land, but keep them in a subject position. The ones that we keep there, but we'll thin the population out, which we do. Genocidal. Concept. I mean, yeah, the thing is, it isn't. It's unknown English history to most English people,
totally
and people in the UK. With the army moving towards London and Hampton Court, what had happened was the previous June, here in Oxford, like the Parliament had sent up a force of soldiers because the garrison here was particularly radical, full of levellers, and Thomas Rainsborough, William Rainsborough, was the agitator for the regiment that was holding Oxford at that time. The king had run off from Oxford. It had been the royalist capital. And it was probably the most radical regiment in the new modern army. And they'd been informed that they were going to have to go fighting in Ireland. So they were doing this previously, prior to the Putney debates. The discussion about the Irish expedition amongst the grandees had already formed. It's like, how are we going to deal with it? We're going to have to send them off. Break up the army if we can, get rid of the most radical regiments and send the rest off to Ireland to fight it. Like, so they knew about this. And the Royal Artillery train was still in Oxford. All the heavy ordnance of the Royalist Army was still in Oxford, as well as the equipment for the Royal Mint. And you had a mutinous regiment here, and as you said, were demanding the pay, had sent a petition saying we will not go to Ireland under any circumstances. So Parliament sent up a force to commandeer the guns, pay some of them off, and convince the rest that they will be going to Ireland. And they also sent Thomas Rainsborough and his regiment off to recapture the Channel Islands, Jersey. But instead of going to the coast, Thomas Rainsborough came north towards Oxford. And there was an intersection of forces happened in Oxford at the beginning of June 1647. The Leveller leaders in London had a meeting with Cromwell, who was like prevaricating this time. He was trying to use the Levellers, And Cornet Joyce and 200 troopers, Leveller troops from London, set off north as well at the beginning of June. And they both arrived. All of these groups then collided in Oxford on the 1st and 2nd of June. Thomas Rainsborough's regiment came into the town, along with Cornet Joyce and the Leveller soldiers from London, confronted the troops, the parliamentary troops and the commissioners sent up by Parliament, disarmed them and confiscated the money they confiscated the Royal Artillery train and the Mint. They issued a statement that the grandees in control of the army could no longer command the force, and they issued an instruction to the rest of the Royal Army, the rest of the New Model Army, to meet at a rendezvous at Triple O Heath near Newbury about a week later. And then the army gradually started moving south towards London. The same day that happened in Oxford, a detachment of troops from the garrison here in Oxford went with Cornet Joyce and the other troops that came from London to Holmby House, just across the border in Buckinghamshire, and arrested the king by popular mandate. Nothing like that had ever happened before, ever, anywhere else. It was an insurgent army that did that. That wasn't on the orders of Parliament or any of the grandees. It was the levellers in the army under their own initiative, in discussion with Cromwell, who thought for his own advantage this might be a good thing. So the king then was transferred then under house arrest to Hampton Court, and as the army got close to London, the grandees are negotiating with the king, are willing to release him. They hadn't placed him under arrest. That was the levels in the army. And the army had gradually been moving towards London and threatening to occupy the city and close down Parliament.
Well, what was the origin of the levellers? Like, where did their kind of like? Because I know there's like, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like, I don't really know the ins and outs of this, but because there's the Diggers movement, but were the Diggers the levellers, or
They call themselves the true levels.
The Diggers, so they weren't in the army though. They were just like
No, they were in the army. They were. So though some of them had been in the army, some of them had been in the army.
Oh, okay. So like
But we were talking when Nick's talking about the agitators, those are like serving soldiers in the army.
Yeah.
Representing leveller
As
ideas.
I understand it, the levellers, you've kind of got civilian levellers and military levellers. With
Yeah.
crossover between the two.
Yeah.
You are going for let's politically reclaim stuff, let's do these things. The Diggers with a sort of direct action, there's some land over there.
Yeah.
It's springtime, we've got some seeds.
Moving on, digging.
Let's just go and set the thing up. And then they were doing the pamphlets, they were doing the ideas as well, but they were also this kind of,
Yeah.
we're just gonna do it, show that it works.
yeah.
Prove to other people that it works, and it's not just, there's a quote from Winstanley that I wish I could remember, which is ironic, which is kind of like words are nothing, everything is action.
Mm-hmm.
So where
And
did
it's remembered by those words, which is,
the direct action movement, road protest movement and stuff, the
Yeah.
90s and stuff, and where the Diggers was that focus on that.
And so they.
I mean, the levellers movement has been building up since the late 60s, 30s, as a challenge to royal power and against enclosures. Initially, the term leveller had been used explicitly against insurgent commoners during revolt in the Midlands in 1606. I think was it 8? It's one of those 1607.
Yeah.
That's a couple of difference. But I mean, there's an idea that it had gone back even further in time, and that levelling meant actually levelling the fences and hedges, levelling the landscape again, making it commons. Yeah.
So, fences and hedges.
So the levelling was an actual direct action in a physical action in terms of pulling down fences and
So-
filling in ditches.
So there's also like related to the reclaiming of the commons.
Yeah.
Of the common land.
Originally, the original
Yeah.
use of land.
Yeah.
So the levellers, I mean, if they were trying to reclaim the commons, then they came from what, like, were they kind of like the tenant farmer classes and stuff? Like, is that what the, you know, I'm just trying to get an idea of what,
Yeah.
you know.
Social background.
They're a very mixed bunch, and in the end, by 1647, they've published a manifesto that's thought to be like the first modern political constitution, the agreement of the people that Nick mentioned there. And they developed political organisation that amounted to party structure. They had branches right across the country. There were hundreds of thousands of people were engaged in it. They had their own newspapers and magazines. And a body of thought developed around, as Nick said, around the constitutional area. So people like John Milburn, Richard Warwin, William Warwin and Richard Overton have been developing constitutional democratic ideas for the previous 10 years. They really gained popular traction by that point, and to the point that they had such traction that the army was saturated with these ideas and went into full-scale mutiny against the powers that be. And don't forget, this is the most catastrophic war that the population had ever suffered. Also, far more damage and mortality than any of the medieval dynastic wars or any other war that ever happened. It was an absolute catastrophe. So it was an hellish environment with revolutionary movements like sparking out of it. And just at the same time as that was happening here in Oxford, and then the army went into full mutiny here. A social revolution occurred in Naples, which is highlighted in the chapter there. And the leader of the social revolution in Naples, a guy called Tommaso di Agnello, shortened to Masaniello, he became known as.
Before we go into that, Kieran,
so there were a lot of things happening at the same time.
that
you've got to connect together.
one question about a few things you wanted to say earlier on. I've got the question.
No,
Okay.
One thing that I couldn't find most to, I was thinking that as you were saying, this radicalism was rising up, there was dissent, there were these revolutionary ideas fermenting. Why didn't they just pay the new model army? Why didn't they do it for a year when it was Parliament broke? Do you know?
Yeah, they were pretty broke. Yeah. They were raising loans from merchants in the City of London, so they were already knocked to the City of London. And that was another reason for the Irish expedition, because they had to pay off the City of London, which was, who already had a big stake in the northern plantation, hence London. But Londonderry was basically given to merchants in the City of London. And the Ulster plantation was already a cash cow. And so they'd already seen how it could work. And now they wanted it rolling across the rest of the island market in long-term terms.
There was also stuff around paying them around if they paid everyone, if paid the army, they all leave. You've then got a load of people who you're not owing them anything. As long as they were still owing the money, they'd stay in the army so that they'd get the money eventually. As soon as you've got a load of fully trained soldiers all paid off and then free to do what they want.
The ironic. I mean, it is in a way, you're right, Jack. But the ironic thing is that I don't know if it was their moral qualms or things like that, but they would like to disband some of these radical regiments, and actively did try to disband them. To disband them, they need to pay them the back pay. They didn't have sufficient resources to disband the radical elements because they'd have to make financial outlay that they didn't have. So the thing is then, right, we're going to have to coerce them to go and enslave the Irish again. And they did suffer massive attrition. There are tens of thousands of soldiers of the New Model Army died in Ireland.
There's like
disease.
some kind of statistics.
It destroyed the New Model Army. It was said explicitly after the campaign, when the campaign now ended in 1652. There is no more New Model Army. It had been broken. So in a sense, that was a success for the Grandees as well.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about the army at that point. say, like you were saying about militias and, you know, sort of small groupings, because, you know, regiments were generally raised by commissioners of the Shire, you know, and they, you know, they didn't get, like, soldiers weren't paid anything.
Yeah, well, this army was.
There's no press, you mean, they were just conscripted.
Well, you were about to train bands, you were about to train local troops, so every town in the locality had a militia trained bands. So there were laws demanding that each man go out and fire so many arrows.
Yeah.
Or do somebody else practice. No, that was just about living in the locality.
Yeah,
Well, this was the thing about the new model army was a modern army. This is the change about this is what's important, is that we're moving into the modern age. With the level of movement looks like a political party, and the new model army looks like a modern army.
Yeah.
So, like the ranking structure that there is in the British Army now was first adopted by the new model army. So the term for an infantry soldier, a private soldier, that was first adopted by the infantry of the new model army. And the structuring of the army, and it was about paying them. It was actually about promising them something, that you're fighting for a cause.
Yeah.
Like, you're not just mercenaries. You're crusaders, religious warriors, in a sense, of fighting for democracy. In the sense of a people's army in that sense.
Well, not a mere mercenary army hired to serve any arbitrary power of state, but called forth and conjured by several declarations of Parliament to the defence of our own and the people's rights and liberties.
This is something very novel, very, very novel. No European army had been framed like this before, and because it was so novel, it became very effective and smashed the Royal Army. And probably prior to the destruction of the army through the Irish campaign, was the most effective land force in Europe, probably for 3 or 4 years, and would have defeated any army in the field.
Yeah, I'm sure that once you had like a lot of soldiers that are basically.
I mean, the Scots found that, unfortunately, to their cost at a certain point when they had to encounter it.
Well,
Because it was a bit of a juggernaut development.
Well, that's true, and Cromwell basically invaded Scotland and pretty much conquered it. But I think the thing was that the thing with the Scottish army and like the way in which was different was because they were still using that old sort of system of like not conscription exactly, but you were
Clientelism.
Well, you had your own, like, each regiment was basically raised by a particular lord, and then like you had to like go, because that was part of your duty, as literally few duty, you know, that you had to do as your, you know, sort of being able to live on the land.
Feudal Jews.
Yeah, and so it was an unusual situation. Yeah, so I guess that's a new model. That's what I was trying to get at. Was the new model army was not built upon those sort of principles of like duty to a superior, and that's hence why it was probably seen as like the more democratic of an army. But the point was that they were getting paid. They were getting paid, so they were essentially not in the old sense of like where it was like you were basically paid to be in the army because of like your duty that you had to give.
It was
sort of the reverse.
to supply and guarantee a certain number of men as well.
Exactly.
I suppose that then the Royal Army, so the Parliamentary Army initially didn't do very well because it was the Royal Army. They had all the equipment, and they had all the gear. But the Royal Army was operating on a feudal basis like that. Still, and then they came up against a new kind of army, right? And
so for Frankenstein monster.
Yeah. So there's something dialectical in it. There's a dialectical movement.
It's power.
Well,
remember the Scott. So very simply, is it right? Basically, the Scots were sided with Cromwell in the first Civil War, and then the King in the second. Is that right, broadly, or no? Okay.
So it's kind of like the Scottish Parliament at that time was in a big state of uncertainty, basically, and there was a lot of it had to do with the Covenanting movement. The Covenanters, and this is what I was trying to get at, where the Levellers came from, because the Covenanting movement basically was a Presbyterian movement that refused to follow the Anglican service prescriptions of the king, who essentially was the King of Scotland as well at the time. So, and what happened was that originally they were the Covenanters, like they all signed the National Covenant, and like then you were conscripted into the Covenanting army, and basically
It's like crusading.
it was, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, and
It's feudal thing.
it was feudal, but it was also very much around religious ideology. And I mean, I kind of look at the Covenanters, and you know, quite often some of the parliamentary people has basically been like the Taliban. You know, they were warlords that had like a religious mission. They were like literally, they were the right ones in a war against, you know, all other like people who were non-believers, you know, essentially. And so they basically, and the non-believers also meant essentially the papists, you know, who were, you know, the Antichrist, really, you know. And, you know, but like I say, most of the people that lived on the land, you know, in Ireland were just regular everyday Catholics, you know. And, you know, but they're going back to what was happening in Scotland at the time. They had the Duke of Montrose. I think it was like Montrose basically flipped sides because originally he was a Covenanter and then he became a Royalist. And so he was who ended up fighting, or at least trying to fight, Cromwell's army. But again, that was political expedience, you know, because he was trying to basically, because the government at the time.
Well, the Scots elite now knew that once Hobbes came out with Leviathan, the idea of Hobbes, like, as long as this external power, but what terrified Hobbes was a population out of control. So he wrote another book, Behemoth. And the Scottish elite was scared of the level of movement in the new modern army, most powerful military force on the islands. And it's got a radical edge. And the Parliament doesn't seem to have control of it. And considerations like that, when does Charles escape? And there is massive suspicion around Charles's escape from Hampton Court. And goes immediately to Montrose's army.
Yeah.
Right immediately, while the debates are going on. Really tricky point in the debate for Cromwell and Fairfax. And the grandees effectively released the king because they weren't willing to go so far at that moment. They realised they were being pushed in the direction where the Levellers in the army wanted the king's execution and the Republic declaring, and, you know, big changes to the constitutional order. So the best thing to do at that point is let the king go and get them to fight again. And immediately, as soon as the debates were closed down by Cromwell and Fairfax announcing that the king had escaped and that we now must re-exert military discipline in the army so we can have no more of these mutinies. Agitators, you must go back to your regiments and do what your officers tell you now, because we're back at war now. Like, this is the way people work. History is not some sort of fucking fantasy. These are real people, like, who are doing things for like concrete, solid, material reasons when they do it. You know, not for abstract ideas around constitutional reform or whatever like that. It's pure survival. You know, on power play. Like you said, you're interested in tyranny and issues around that. You know,
But also survival from
real politics.
Yeah, real politics, exactly. It's like, you know, there were major people at play who basically were just trying to preserve their position, you know, and, you know,
They were counter-revolutionary, therefore. They will become very counter-revolutionary in this situation.
Well, they were, yeah, I mean, apart from the fact that they were the ones in power, so they weren't revolutionary because they were already the ones holding power.
In the sense of in the sense that in the sense that they'd reject these newfangled options that were like unleashed, like because they'd be big believers in the many-headed iron of the common folk. It needs keeping in line and decapitating.
Well, I mean, yeah, totally. The Campbells were, you know, by all means, not exactly friendly to, you know, they were power hungry, and like, you know, like most sort of elite people. But I think it's just interesting, like what I was trying to sort of get at in terms of like where the levelers came from is that more the fact that at the time was that was the sort of beginning of like I guess the idea of like overturning the structures of land ownership, you know, which, you know, have been like still kind of continuing up to this day, but just through sort of various different permutations. And that's what I was trying to get at, like, you know, where they were coming from. If they were like working the land, you know, they obviously felt themselves that they had the right to the land. I mean, like, I guess this is going back to the Neudar thing where I was working. One of the things probably you may not have heard of, there's the 7 Men of Neudar, which was quite a recent, essentially, attempt by exactly what you were saying about like the military people who were involved in the New Model Army, sort of believing because they would get some payback essentially for their duty, their time in the army. Well, these 7 Men of Neudar fought in World War II, and they thought that they were going to get land, and they never got it, and that was quite extensively done across the Highlands and Islands. You know, all these people went to fight in the war and never got what they were promised. You know,
Who promised them that
the government?
7 acres in the middle.
Yeah, they got nothing. And so
The government did do that.
They did.
They tried to. That's the way they tried to deal with the land war in Ireland, by creating a class of small proprietors with grants of land, and then they applied the same thing with the cotters in Scotland as well. Then Crofton, you know. But yes, so they were quite big schemes, but at a certain point, they're not going to like reinstitute the commons under any.
No, exactly. So what happened was that like, I mean, this was way after the times of the Crofton Commission and stuff, but these 7 Men of Neudar basically, after coming back from the war, decided to do a land raid in Neudar. They came over, they took over some land, and they were there for, I don't know how long exactly, but the landowner, the lord at the time, was called Lord Brocket, and he basically took them to court. And it went all the way up to the highest court, you know, which at the time was the House of Lords. And eventually they were evicted because, you know, because of the legal proceedings. But they sort of set a precedent, basically, you know, by trying to, you know, just land raids. I think they were the most famous ones at the time because Lord Brocket was a Nazi sympathizer. So he was basically
Low-hanging fruit.
I think. Well, I didn't realise this, but the reason why the telephone lines first came to Neudar was because Neville Chamberlain came to stay. I mean, this is all like recent history. It's like only less than 100 years ago, you know. And he was basically the person at the time who was the owner, Lord Brocket. You know, he was notorious. You know, he went to Hitler's birthday, all this sort of stuff. You know, and then eventually, you know, like this is the same bit of land that these people now own, the community now owns. You know, or at least a part of it, because Brocket had like about 50,000 acres, and the Neudar Foundation now is only about 17,000. So, but it's a really interesting history around there, and that's kind of what I mean, that sort of same struggle basically that had been going on with the levelers, that had to come from some disagreement, disenfranchisement, essentially.
Dispossession. Dispossession.
Dispossession, exactly.
What had a lot of traction at that time was the idea of the rights of the freeborn Englishman under Norman yoke. So then there was the notion that the Normans would come in and institute a set of repressive feudal laws upon the English, which were a gross imposition, and that we should reclaim our natural, inalienable rights. And then this kind of thinking had been developing in the previous 20 years, and started getting incorporated to jurisprudence, like Edward's Code and that. So yeah, that was an important idea that they played on then.
Would anyone like a cup of tea before we go round the tea, before we wrap up? Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
One as well. But ordinary tea, Roy Bosch, and mint tea.
Don't get a
Yeah.
ordinary.
I'd make it now.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll have an ordinary cup of tea. I might go have a cigarette.
All right.
Is someone still on the phone?
Yeah.
We can't offer you a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Did you want any comments?
Yeah. Jess says I've got I haven't not got anything to add other than gratitude for being able to be part of it and nourishing the English part of my soul. English history. Yeah.
This is one submerged aspect of English history that people need to know about, so that they can modify their identities a bit. They can feel a bit more comfortable about themselves. It's excavating the rebellious, insurrectionary, and radical elements in English history that have been purposely obscured during the process of processing population. And then there's a fight against it on the left to get this stuff out there again, to get people talking about the peasant revolt, to get people talking about the levels. This is just political combat.
Yes,
like
the
deploying
thing
these
was
historical
the right
tropes.
of monopolize national identity.
Yeah.
So then the sort of people who rightly feel like they don't identify with Queen and Empire and fucking all this stuff that passes for what's supposed to be we're supposed to be proud about England. Just revolves the whole idea. And then you get people say, oh, why should I be ashamed of being English? No, we're going to be proud of being English. Good people are going to be proud of that in their Englishness.
Because that's a reaction.
Because there's plenty there.
There is, yeah. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I went to school in England. As you probably can tell, I have an English accent. And although I am American, which is why I thought this would be quite interesting as well. It's about transatlantics.
But we didn't really get to that. We didn't really get into the divarication, like living down rivers into the oceans. So, I mean, at the end of the chapter, it's looking at what happens then, the consequences then, running through Ireland, running through Barbados, running through the River Gambia and the establishment of the slave trade on the West Africa coast, and then into Virginia, culminating in Bacon's Rebellion, and an analysis of Bacon's Rebellion in these chapters. And the formation during this period, it's quite a complex argument in the chapter, linking together all these narratives. It's beautiful history. This is history of poetry. That basically what happens during this period is that people find new forms of opposition, but also racism is instrumentalized and invented as an ideology. And it's written down in slave codes because it's necessary to separate the poor whites from the blacks. Because these multi-racial insurrections where the poor whites, like the enslaved Irish, or the indentured servants, who then go and team up with the African slaves they will destroy our system. It will not, we won't be able to make money here. We won't be able to produce the capital.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they're going to kill us off.
Yeah.
They were terrified.
Yeah.
So what to do? You separate the whites from blacks. You do that, institute slave code, and then start saying there is some distinction in humanity between the whites and the blacks.
Yeah.
So like the conquest of Ireland, the whole development is basically counter-revolutionary.
Yeah. So there's a debate about slavery then in the British Parliament then in 1659, just before the Restoration.
Just after the death of Cromwell.
That's for the death of Cromwell, and agitators have been elected again, right? So they've seen it as an opportunity now to reignite the radical movement in the army. Now that Cromwell's dead, General Monk is not going to have it, and the elite don't want it. They'd rather have the king back. So there's this debate, but it's framed around the enslavement of Europeans by corsairs, Barbary pirates in North Africa. And it's surely shameful that Christians should be subjected to this treatment. And then distinctions are being made with the black. So there's the rights of the freeborn Englishman now have crystallized into white supremacy. It's at this point, modern property relations, racism, and white supremacy are all co-emerging.
Sword bucket. Yeah, but yeah, I totally know.
Yeah, so it's a crucial seminal time period then, from the beginning of the 1640s up to the end of the century. It's like the foundations of our iniquitous world. And yeah, I'm sorry about it, it's one of my favourite books. I'm absolutely saturated with this.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's, it's something you're really interested in, you get passionate about it, that's what it's about, isn't it? So.
This guy, Peter Limehouse, is the greatest Marxist historian left standing at the moment. After Eric Osborne died, he's probably got that time. But him and Marcus Rydecker collaborated on quite a few books. They covered different aspects of it. Marcus Rydecker's brilliant on pirates. Because you don't think of generally pirates as a revolutionary movement, but they're one of the most threatening revolutionary movements in human history. Along with just running away from oppressive situations, running away and forming armed bands to attack those who made you run away in the first place. That's all it featured in human history.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, good to see what this group is up to. Let's see, as we've both been here, not before.
So what you're expecting? Or,
I don't know what to expect. I wasn't expecting anything in particular, but yeah, interesting. Because I mean, obviously, I've met Darren before, and we were just chatting like earlier. And no, it's really interesting stuff. I mean, it's all like things I'm interested in, and have been for a while, and still am.
yes. Felt like I get really into one thing, like the Diggers, and enjoy this sort of thing. Like 10 years ago, I got really into it, and then there are bits in this that's like, oh, that links up with that, that links up with that. But I haven't got, like, Kieran's got that sort of grand sweep of that happened in the June, and then 3 days later that happened, and by November that happened.
That's
So
it.
it's more like, William Everard is in somewhere else. So check the Wikipedia. Oh, they jumped up with those ones.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. That's what I mean. I didn't know the names of like all of these people, but heard of all this mysteries. Like
Same like starting point of view, there was a film made in the 70s.
oh yes, Stanley. Yeah.
Did you want
No.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched that actually from Stanley. Yeah.
Just Gerald Winstanley's pamphlets and stuff are online.
Yeah.
So you can just, like with the debates, they just sort of deep dive into it and
Get lost.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to put them in the context of one of the things that I always find kind of throws me a bit. It's just that the religious mentality at the time was so strong, and the conceptual framework that they had. You know, they're a millenarian group, you know, that believes that the coming of Christ is now or you know. So it's so different to, but it's so interesting to me that out of that religion, you know, comes both conservative ideas and radical ideas. You know, they're all contained in there. Cromwell's obviously a Puritan as well. And he's kind of entertaining some of these ideas and also using them as heroes. Ultimately comes down as on the side of kind of conservatism. He wants to be a, you know, wants to be one of the elites. But it's all these religious ideas that are into them, you know, that are coming to the surface with ideas of political ideologies.
Well, one of the things I was going to mention when you start talking about that is Milton. Like one of the other figures in that period was quite, you know, one that I know of and I've heard of a lot. Obviously, as a poet, I'm like, you know, sort of generally well-known, sort of bringing forth of ideas like the whole sort of idea of the Paradise Lost, you know, Milton's Paradise Lost. I mean, like, you know, that's the same, pretty much the story of like, what's his name, like His Dark Materials is based on, you know, like all of that sort of, it's common, it's current, like in our society, you know, like, you know, these sort of ideas that come from these roots. I mean, William Blake as well.
It's antinomian. It actually ends the chapter with a quote about what was it said?
Blake.
It says all this returns, this antinomianism returns.
We were just saying about the religious roots of these.
This was the everlasting. So here we go. I'll do a bit of ranting. A bit of ranting. Like the proper stuff. This is a great resource. This is a great resource for me. So they brought in an act on 9th of August 1650 aimed directly at the Ranters and Ebenezer Cobb, basically. This one particular book against the suppression.
The only cop who isn't the past.
Against the suppression of blasphemous and dissentient views. So the Ranters, they were members of a loose movement, really called the Brethren of the Free Spirit, or familialists. And they've been around since the Middle Ages. John Bourne was Brethren of the Free Spirit. Peasant Trevor, and it was the mainstream of antinomian thought. Antinomian. That's against all norms, laws, rules. One will not accept ordinances.
The only law is inscribed in your heart. By Jesus.
It's the inner light.
All the rest is sacrilege.
The inner light is God. So the God is inside you, and it's inside everything else. They developed quite a pantheistic view, but I mean, they had to be described as like the most extreme of the groups that were classed as levels. Gordon said it, extreme left. The kind of language that, so he was put in prison and he had to recant under death. We saw James Naylor, they put a red hot iron through his tongue because he wouldn't shut up. So Cobb said, "Thus saith the Lord, I inform you that I overturn, and as the bishops, Charles, and the lords have had their turn overturned, so your turn shall be next, ye surviving great ones, by what name or title soever dignified or distinguished, whoever you are that calls me the eternal God, who am universal love and whose service is perfect freedom and pure libertinism. And now, thus saith the Lord, though you can as little endure the word levelling as could the late slain dead Charles, your forerunner who is gone before you, and then leave fear the devil name as he had of the levellers, men levellers, which is, and who indeed are but shadows of most terrible yet great and glorious good things to come. Behold, 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 I, the eternal God, the Lord of hosts, who am that mighty leveller, I'm coming, even at the doors, to level in good earnest, to level to some purpose, to level with a witness, to level the hills with the valleys, and to lay the mountains low. But this is not all, for lo, I come, saith the Lord, with a vengeance, to level also all your honour, riches, and to stain the pride of all your glory, and bring into contempt all the honourable, both persons and things upon this earth. For this honour, nobility, gentility, propriety, superfluity, hath without contradiction been the father of hellish, horrid pride, arrogance, haughtiness, loftiness, murder, malice, and all manner of wickedness and impiety, yea, the cause of all the blood that ever hath been shed, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of the last levellers that were shot to death at Burford. And now, as I live, saith the Lord, I am come to make inquisition for blood, for murder and pride, etc. I see the root of it all. The axe is laid to the root of the tree by the eternal God myself, saith the Lord. I will hew it down, and as I live, I will plague your honour, pomp, greatness, superfluity, and confound it into parity, equality, and community, that the neck of horrid pride, murder, malice, and tyranny, etc., may be chopped off in one blow, and that myself, the eternal God, who am universal love, may fill the earth with universal love, universal peace, perfect equality, and perfect freedom, which never can by human soul or strength be accomplished. So that is high octane ranting, and like, people don't understand. This is really fucking challenging.
Did you write it down?
Yeah, he was in prison for it.
Somebody had to be stood next to it.
He wrote 2 volumes of it in 1649, just at this time that we're talking about. While all this is happening, him and others scribbling and stuff.
Yeah.
Down. Yeah, and as far as the soldiers go, then after Robert Lockyer was executed after the Bishopsgate mutiny, a large section of the New Model Army then goes into full mutiny in April 1649, and then Cromwell comes up with a big force from London and surrounds them at Burford. And after a short fight, they get overpowered. And then some of the leaders are executed at Burford. But the mutiny rumbled on. The leader of it overall, who escaped from Burford, was William Thompson. His brother, Cornet Thompson, was shot at Burford. But he got away, but he was captured a little bit later in Gloucester. And this is part of the pamphlet he put forward in May 1649, just at this time. He's the leader of the rebellion. No, this.
Before you get to that, did they actually believe that God was speaking through them?
Yes.
So that's heretical to the rank. Isn't it?
Yeah.
He's saying, I am the Almighty God.
Yeah, they wouldn't even put up with elected, say, the Presbyterian model, where the congregation might elect the pastor. They wouldn't even have that. You know, it's total horizontalization for the Ramsers, and anyone could have the inner life, divine life. And so it's some women, black people. In fact, they were venerated as more likely to reveal the divine light. Those right at the bottom.
Thomas Muntz is even quite takes the piss out of the priest. So he's about a century earlier.
Who is he?
He's in the very early days, so it's contemporary of Luther.
Okay.
And becomes associated with the German Peasant War.
Oh, yeah.
And he's sort of the kind of theological leader of the German Peasant War, and radical proto-communist in a way, preached the abolition of private property, as private property is sacrilegious, basically, and this antinomial tradition, all of this laws saying this is mine, that's all fucking sacrilege. And but he's quite even like critical of the priests and so on who always refer to the Bible, and he sort of says the Bible. He loves the Bible, but he's like still it's dead words at the end of the day. You've got to feel it.
Living presence.
Yeah.
I mean, for them, for their answers, it was like it was Satan, that the God that's been projected, the demiurge.
Yeah.
So this is what then goes back to Blake and his idea of the demiurge that's been portrayed as the God of the creator is actually an evil, oppressive force in the universe, more akin to the devil, who's been glorified by all these pigs.
Again, it's like very Philip Pullman with the authority.
Yeah.
You know, he's sort of like just taken so many of those ideas straight out of that era.
Where the best stories are nice. These kind of periods of intense.
I tell you, I mean, I just love the language. I won't read all of it. This is William Thompson's. This is during the course of the mutiny. He composes this, and it's called England's Standard Advanced in Oxfordshire, and it's written in May 1649, just after the defeat at Burford, while he's on the run.
What's Standard Advanced?
England's Standard Advanced in Oxfordshire. He goes to oppress, torment, and vex the people. Whereas it is notorious to the old world that neither the faith of the Parliament nor yet the faith of the army formally made to the people of the nation in behalf of their common right, freedom and safety, have been at all observed or made good, but both absolutely declined and broken, and the people only served with bare words and fair promising papers, and left utterly destitute of all help or delivery, and that this hath principally been by the prevalency and treachery of some eminent persons now domineering over the people is most evident. The solemn engagement of the army at Newmarket and Tripolo Heath, and we got into insurrection, by them destroyed. The Council of Agitators destroyed. The blood of war shed in times of peace. Petitions for common freedom suppressed by force of arms, and petitioners abused and terrified. The lawful trial by 12 sworn men of the neighbourhood subverted and denied. Bloody and tyrannical courts called a High Court of Justice and a Council of State erected. The power of the sword advanced and set in the seats of the magistrates. The civil laws stopped and subverted, and the military introduced even to the hostile sieger imprisonment, trial, sentence, and execution of death upon divers of the free people of this nation, leaving no visible authority, dissolving all into a factious junto and council of state, usurping and assuming the name, stamp, and authority of Parliament to oppress, torment, and vex the people, whereby all lives, liberties, and estates are subdued to the wills of these men. No law, no justice, no rights or freedom, no ease of grievances, no removal of unjust barbarous taxes, no regard to the cries and groans of the poor to be had, while utter beggary and famine like a mighty torrent have broken in upon us and already seized several parts of the nation. We are resolved as one man, even to the hazard and expense of our lives and fortunes, to endeavour the redemption of the magistracies of England from under the force of the sword, to vindicate the petition of right and the agreement of the people, to set the unjustly imprisoned free, to relieve the poor, to settle this commonwealth upon the grounds of common right, freedom, and safety, choosing rather to die for freedom than live as slaves. We are gathered and associated together upon the bare account of Englishmen, with swords in our hands, to redeem ourselves and the land of our nativity from slavery and oppression. Now, so this is secular language now. Now we're talking about, you know, this is a step beyond the language that you mobilised the covenant.
Yeah, it's more,
you know,
to do with, sort of power structure and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And what we think of now as modern politics in a repressive situation, social movements arise. And that's the kind of language that people use.
It's interesting, the same year, they're so different, those two.
Yeah.
Like say one's totally, it's just all about God,
Yeah.
grace and all, and this one's just pure
Yeah.
law, freedom, modern liberal,
Yeah.
radical motions.
Yeah. Constitutional, radical constitutional.
But he would have been a religious
reform.
man himself. He would have been.
He would have been, right? He would have been so. It's just the idiom that he would have been a Puritan. Well, I mean, it's the idiom that you express yourself.
Yeah.
In.
And everybody has different styles.
Were they trying to appeal to the same, like what Drew was talking about, the kind of class and so on? And they're appealing to the same people with this completely opposite language.
I think they're appealing to the same people. Though this is addressed also to Parliament explicitly as a warning. As this is why we've gone into a civil war situation with you. So that's a martial statement in the heat of battle, really.
Yeah. Interesting.
Because one of the other things that, one of the things Cromwell said in the debates was that he managed to shut them up by invoking prayer and saying this is so much, what was it, dross and dung before the power of Christ. Something
Right, yes. Which is all we could say the same about what you just said, Cromwell.
So
all of both the conservative ideas and the radical ideas are contained within religion. They can all be found.
That was the framing of all discourse.
The framework, yeah.
Though, like you were beginning to get now at this time, since Elizabethan times, but now at this point, you have a strong rationalist movement. So they scandalised everybody. So Thomas Hobbes was viewed as an atheist. He didn't really believe in God, like he thought it was a useful thing. But others like Henry Martin, I said, was the leader of one of the most radical of your kind of freebooters in the New Model Army, an independent regiment that went around Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, raiding stately homes, big estates, and literally levelling, kicking out the owners and giving it to the cultivators and redistributing property. And he was one of the signatories on the death warrant for Charles I, and he was an open atheist. So at this time as well, you could be an open atheist. So Milton talks about it was legitimate, that's what he thought, and you could justify it, and then you could justify it in a rational way. It's difficult to argue against. It was a legitimate position to take by this point.
You've been a minority.
You've been an absolute minority. Most political discourse is sort of framed within religious terms.
Yeah. But also, like, it's interesting what you said about the fact they were changing the legal system from Latin to English, or they were demanding that anyway, because that's the language and wrote more.
And the elites.
And people that could understand it were educated.
To win, Cromwell and the Grandees, the execution of Charles I was a compromise with the radical elements.
Right.
The abolition of the House of Lords and the declaration of the Republic was giving them what they wanted. So it gave breathing space at a dangerous time when the army was close to London and could occupy.
Sure, there's going to be something. There's guns to head.
Yeah. Get rid of the king, and it was after the execution of the king that's when Cromwell and the Grandees turned against the levellers, outmaneuvered them, arrested Gilbert and the others, threw them in the Tower, and then there was the Bishopsgate Mutiny as a result of that.
So that's what's so interesting. One thing that's so interesting about it is despite it, because of course there was the Restoration there, wasn't there? So the revolution happens, but compared to other revolutions in other countries, the psychological impact, arguably, it was massive. We know it was massive. It didn't
as I say, in 1629,
When they fell down, there was a big radical stir-up. The Muggletonians and the Fifth Monarchist men and the Ranters appeared again. And in